Hello and welcome to the Culture Reset podcast, where we enjoy talking to great guests about how to create a great workplace culture. I'm Caroline Kenyon, and this time I'm flying solo without my usual co-host Juliet Kumar, and I'm in Birmingham in the offices of Health Innovation West Midlands with someone who's a star in the firmament of ergonomics and human factors. Hello, Fran Ives.
Hello, Caroline.
It's lovely to be here with you and to find out what human factors is all about. But first, Fran, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is Health Innovation West Midlands and what do you do here?
So Health Innovation West Midlands is one of 15 health innovation networks across the country. And we're very much that sort of innovation arm of the NHS. We're there to be that honest broker, that critical friend between academia, industry, healthcare. We're very much striving towards supporting the implementation and adoption of innovation within the NHS. So it's a really exciting area to be in. And I think everybody within our organisation has really got a passion for the NHS and for really looking ahead to the future and trying to support the NHS to move forwards and to implement innovations to better support our patients.
So how does human factors fit in with innovation?
So human factors is such a broad discipline and it can be applied to so many different things. For me, specifically at Health Innovation West Midlands with innovation, what I'm really interested in is the impact of these innovation on people. And very often those people are the staff that are in the hospitals, the organisations that we're working with. And what can sometimes happen is, we look at an innovation and we can see that it has all the academic evidence. It's great at what it does. And we expect to be able to drop it into an organisation and for it to fly without necessarily thinking about what impact it's going to have on the staff and the patients. So I spend a lot of time looking at, well, how is that innovation going to change the way that people work? It might change the way they work in a really positive aspect. It may take out some really laborious steps or parts of the process that are really complicated. But equally, it might mean that by implementing this innovation, we're asking people to do a lot more work. It might be that we're asking them to take more time to do something. I'm working with one organisation at the moment that's got a brilliant innovation that they're implementing, but it requires quite a lot of work from a department that previously wouldn't be involved with that procedure. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to understand the impact on humans. And we can take that learning and share it with other organisations so that when they're implementing the same or similar, they have that learning to hand and they can better implement this new innovation.
For some of us only hear about human factors when something goes wrong. We say, oh, there's a big accident.
Yes.
And it was all due to human factors. In other words, people are to blame. Yes, but that's what you're saying is that's not just the only way of using human factors as an expertise.
No, absolutely not. Whilst we are really interested in why people have behaved in a certain way, but looking at the environment, the equipment, the tasks that have set them up to follow a particular path, actually human factors can be applied in so many ways. And what human factors specialists really strive for is to incorporate human factors thinking right at the very beginning of a project. Because if we are able to think about people, thinking about how they might behave, how they might communicate, how they might make decisions, how they might interact with equipment, undertake the tasks they're doing, or interact with the environment they're in, then we can hopefully design things to best support human well-being and system performance. So often when human factors has been incorporated, we don't notice it because things work smoothly and things work really well. It's when we're frustrated with something, when we're constantly finding we're clicking the wrong button or we're pushing that pull door or we can't navigate through a particular system, that's when human factors really hasn't been considered. But when it goes well, we don't necessarily think about it. So human factors can be applied right at the very beginning of a project. It can also be applied as we tweak things and change things. And of course, it can be applied when things go wrong. But ideally, we want to try and prevent things from going wrong in the first place.
What about ergonomics? Is that different from human factors? Does that take us into a whole new area?
So that's a really interesting question. Ergonomics and human factors are interchangeable terms. What we find is that historically, certain countries, more European countries, tended to use the term ergonomics, and other countries, such as America, use the term human factors. But over the years, the two terms have harmonised. And in fact, in the UK, we used to have the Ergonomics Society, and that changed its name to the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. So we do use the two terms interchangeably. What I think happens, though, is that there's a perception that ergonomics is more about the physical side of the scientific discipline, thinking about posture, musculoskeletal problems, design of physical environments. And there's a perception that human factors is more about that human behaviour, that communication, when actually we're talking about one and the same thing. And it's really interesting that certain industries will favour one or the other. I came into the NHS 20 years ago being known as an ergonomics advisor, and I'm now a human factors specialist. I'm still the same person practising the same discipline, but yet we're sort of changing the terms to keep up with what people really understand.
And when you came into the NHS, what brought you in as a human factors specialist? How did someone think, oh, we need a human factors specialist in the NHS?
It's really thanks to a very forward-thinking occupational health physician, a chap called Dr. Alistair Robertson, and he was leading the occupational health department at University Hospitals Birmingham. And he created the role back in the 1990s. He recognised that there was a real need for somebody to look at the musculoskeletal health of staff. And what was often happening was that staff were coming to the occupational health department with various musculoskeletal problems, but the nurses and the doctors within that department weren't really able to go out and understand how people were working, how they were undertaking their tasks, or the sorts of environments that they were working in. And that's where an ergonomics and human factor specialist comes in, because we go out, we love watching people, we love rolling our sleeves up and getting into workplaces to see people, to talk to them, to observe them, to really understand what their roles are, what their challenges are, and therefore how we can potentially put things in place to help them.
And you were the first human factors specialist to be employed in NHS.
The first qualified person, yeah. So there was a survey done, so an unofficial survey back in 2018, where a human factors specialist in aviation wanted to understand how many qualified human factors specialists there were that were directly employed by NHS trusts. Now, he worked in aviation, he worked in air traffic control, where human factors was really prevalent. And he did a bit of a survey to try and find who was out there in the NHS, who was qualified and doing that role, that embedded role. And he found one person, which was me.
That was you.
And he wrote an article, a chap called Steve Shorrock, he wrote an article entitled The Loneliest Profession. And that really didn't sit well with me, the fact that I was the only one. I knew other people who were perhaps on the periphery of healthcare, or people who were working towards becoming fully qualified and chartered. And I felt that actually this is an opportunity to really try and increase that number. And one of the things that I did was sort of made it a mission to mentor people to become chartered. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, from 2018 to where we are now in 2025, the picture has changed. You know, there are a lot more human factors specialists around. There's always room for improvement. Of course there is. But I now feel like I am part of a network of people, and a really supportive network as well, which is a wonderful place to be in when I reflect back on 2018.
You're not lonely anymore.
I'm not lonely.
And you've recently been elected as a president-elect of the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, which sounds very prestigious. Absolutely, congratulations and well done. And it means you'll be president next year.
Yeah.
What does that involve? What does that role mean for you?
So that role is a huge honour, first and foremost. And the Chartered Institute is now in its 76th year. It's been going an awfully long time. And I've been a member since I was at university. And I suppose for me, it's been a constant presence throughout my life. My professional life. It's given me sort of that ability to develop, that ability to, go from a new graduate not really knowing what they were doing to somebody who hopefully does now know what they're doing and feels confident to sort of be in the human factors world and do good quality pieces of work. I see my role very much as, it's a baton passing. I want the Institute to continue to grow, to continue to support, and to be part of that, and to have a year where I can sort of help with that, and really try to ensure that we're an institute that is promoting human factors, so that human factors is increasing in knowledge. It's in a sort of awareness. More people know about it. That we're more at the forefront of industries, safety critical industries, and that we can continue to develop our profession so that human factors eventually doesn't just be that what is it profession. It becomes something that people do understand, they do know about, and they do value. I'm very passionate about mentoring people and seeing people develop. And so that was sort of one of the reasons, why I was interested in striving to be president, to help those people who are on the ground, who are doing the work, and helping them to have a voice and helping them to develop within their own professions.
Fantastic. And what a role model you are. So can you give us another example now of human factors at work in the NHS? Something else you've done where you've been brought in, or where you've perhaps shouldered your way in because you can see a need. Can you describe how that's been and what difference it's made?
It's interesting you use the term shouldered your way in, because I think sometimes we do have to do that, not necessarily because people don't want us, it's because they don't understand the need for it. And sometimes I joke with people that we're sometimes doing human factors by stealth. We go in and we do our human factors and we don't almost shout about it, but we want people to then understand, oh, actually, do you know what, that made a difference? Because once people sort of understand what a difference it can make, they'll often ask for you to come back. There are all sorts of examples. There's a really interesting piece of work that I'm doing at the moment in an area of a hospital that people don't always really think about, and that is endoscopy decontamination. So it's very much a sort of a back room area. Nobody really gives much thought to what happens to all those endoscopes once they've been used in procedures. Where do they go? How are they cleaned? And there are a whole department of people cleaning these endoscopes. And this is particularly a nice piece of work because when I was working in the hospital, I spent quite a lot of time in there with the people who were stood at the sinks manually cleaning these endoscopes. These are hugely expensive pieces of equipment, and they demand a lot of care and a lot of attention to make sure that they are cleaned properly for patients, but also we're taking care of them to avoid any damage. And people would stand at sinks for about 20 minutes, sort of poking these sort of fine brushes down all of the channels to make sure that everything was clean. And I spent a lot of time with these people because they were often getting musculoskeletal problems in their necks and their shoulders. And when you actually looked at the types of postures that people were adopting, it wasn't really surprising. They were hunched over these sinks. And some people actually really enjoyed the job, although it doesn't sound like necessarily a very enticing and appealing job. For some people, that sort of solitude and just being able to get on with their work without any sort of interruption was actually a really desirable thing to do, but they were suffering with their musculoskeletal problems. Fast forward to now, and we're working with an innovator at the moment who's developed a machine that actually takes away that manual cleaning of the endoscope. The interesting thing was I was talking to this innovator and they were, very excited about their innovation. They have all of the clinical evidence to show that it's just as good, if not better, than the manual cleaning. And what they hadn't necessarily considered, though, was the impact on staff. So I was able to go back to the work that I did a few years ago and say to them, have you thought about the really positive impact this has on staff? If staff aren't having to stand at the sinks doing this manual cleaning, I wonder if we're seeing a reduction in musculoskeletal problems. Are we seeing a reduction in sickness absence? Are we seeing a reduction in staff turnover? Hidden things, hidden elements that people haven't necessarily thought about. So we're doing a piece of work at the moment to look at how has this impacted in a positive way the staff within our hospitals.
That's an element of evaluation
Yes,
that you wouldn't necessarily think of. You'd think of the health economics, wouldn't you?
absolutely.
But you wouldn't think of the impact on the individuals, which in itself is an economic benefit because they're then able to continue working.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really interesting. You've also been involved in advising on new building, haven't you?
Yes. So my first example of that was when I first came into the NHS 20 years ago, and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which is now 15 years old, was at the design stage. And that was a really sort of fascinating insight to me on how new builds are designed. And there's all sorts of new builds going on around the country within healthcare. And human factors can play a really important part, not only in looking at the specific design of a room and whether we've got everything we need, whether the sinks are positioned in the right place or the work surfaces are located at the correct height, but also looking at which departments you have next to each other, those adjacencies. Does it make sense that Department X is located to Department Y? Which patients need to transfer between the departments? What's the route that we're going to be taking them? Is that an appropriate route? And again, as I've said, human factors is best placed at the beginning of a project. And this is a perfect example because it's far easier to change a plan when it's on paper or it's on computer than when a building is actually built, functioning, and we suddenly realise that wall's a bit of an inconvenience, or why did we place that room there? Actually, it would have been far better down the corridor. So although it can seem like you're adding in an extra person or an extra step, or, oh, this is going to increase our project time, actually, we can look at those things right from the very beginning and hopefully design a better building.
And save a lot of pain in the long term.
I hope so.
Not every organisation can have its own human factors specialist, and we know that in the NHS especially. So what can people do on the ground if they want to look at human factors and apply some of the principles?
You're absolutely right in saying human factors specialists within NHS trusts are quite rare beasts, but that's not to say there aren't people within organisations who have either some form of human factors skills or they have that natural ability to think in a person-centred way. What I'm often finding is that there are people within NHS organisations who've discovered ergonomics and human factors through perhaps reading things or going on courses. We may not necessarily know that they're there, but they're just sort of trying to strive to make improvements within their own departments and own environments. And when I was working as a human factors professional within an organisation, I was the only one. But that's not to say that I had to do every single bit of human factors improvement. And I had a really nice example of working with the emergency department. And there was a consultant there who knew a little bit about human factors, and he invited me down one day and he said, we need some human factors support. And I said, what specifically do you want? And he said, I don't know, I just feel that we could benefit from some human factors support. So I stood there and I watched and I observed, and you very quickly become invisible when you're standing watching in what is a very busy department. And I stood with a colleague who also had a great interest in human factors, but she by background was an emergency department nurse. So the combination was great because she had the emergency department experience and knowledge, and I had more of the human factors, which was a really great combination. And what we actually identified was that there was a particular process, the way that patients who had self-presented to the emergency department with chest pain came in and were dealt with within the department. We felt that that process could be improved upon. It was a little bit clunky, and we identified that there were lots of parts and areas of that process where people could go wrong. And what I mean by that is the patient could end up going down the wrong corridor, or they could end up not being identified to staff. And it wouldn't have been anyone's intention to miss these people, but it would have just been because we were asking the patients to follow quite a complicated set of instructions to get from place A to place B. And one of the important things for me when we were trying to identify how to make this better was to make sure that the staff within the department felt that they were part of the process. So rather than me coming in and saying, well, you've got this problem and this is what you're going to do about it, it's really important that we worked collaboratively so that it was their solution just as much as mine. It's far more likely that a department is going to feel comfortable in adopting a solution if they feel it's theirs to own. And that was a brilliant way for me to develop some really great relationships with that department and get to know these people. And it was a really fantastic way for them to understand a little bit more about human factors. It wasn't me standing up in front of them doing a teaching session, but inevitably they started to understand the science just through our conversations and understanding how we were collecting our information, how we were understanding the problem. And we came up with a solution which was implemented, and it was quite successful. But in many respects, that's not the success of the story, really, because what I noticed after that piece of work was that the number of calls I had from ED staff increased, but the nature of those calls changed. So instead of them saying, we've got a problem, can you come and help? It was very much, I've identified a challenge. This is what I've done to have a go. Can you come and have a look and see what you think? So there was an example of somebody who was struggling to use a form, didn't feel the layout was particularly good, and they'd had a go at redesigning it. And what they were asking me to do was, can you have a look? I think I've made a better form, but I just want you to glance over it. And there was another individual, a doctor who was working in ED, and he'd identified that in the resus bay, which is where they take the sickest patients, there were trolleys in each of the bays that contained all the airway equipment. But each of the trolleys was stocked in a different way. So there was no consistency between what was in the first drawer, the second drawer, the third drawer between the bays. So he'd taken time to think about how to make sure that every trolley in each of the bays was the same, which equipment needed to go in which drawer, which was the most important equipment, how best to group the pieces of equipment. And then he went on to think about how does he label the drawers, the type of font, the colour, the size, the positioning of the labels. And that was just fantastic for me to see, because they'd had that knowledge, but also that confidence to make improvements and changes themselves.
Brilliant. And so you're learning your skills, they're being picked up and used by others, and the impact then is rippling out into an organisation.
Absolutely.
That must have felt like a proud moment.
Absolutely. We can't have human factors specialists everywhere, but that's not to say that we can't have some really, really great staff making some positive changes.
So anyone listening who wants to learn more and possibly even become a human factors specialist, what would you advise them to do?
So go to the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors webpage. They have some really great resources on what human factors is, and they can be a great introduction to the scientific discipline. And if people are really interested and they want to go on to do further study, there's some recognised courses on there that you could look into, knowing that they've been accredited by the Chartered Institute, which means that they're really good quality courses, and ones that will give you that really good grounding into the science.
Thank you. And we'll put a link in the podcast notes. So that's great. Thank you very much. Now, final question. The Culture Reset podcast is all about creating the best culture for success. So if you look at that through the lens of a human factors specialist, would you have a top tip for listeners?
I think for me, human factors is all about people. It's about understanding people, creating relationships with people. And I think really my top tip would be to take things back to basics and to rediscover the art of having a good quality conversation, and really ensuring that when you're having conversations with people, that you're listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And sometimes that means sort of sitting on your hands and not jumping in and not always feeling like you have to have a solution, but to actually let people speak, understand people, understand where they're coming from. Also understand what other things might be going on with those individuals that may not be immediately apparent. We can make an awful lot of assumptions, but just taking it back to the old art of a good conversation can be a really great place to start.
Lovely tip. Thank you so much. From a communications person especially, it's great to hear. Listening is possibly more important than talking, isn't it? When
Absolutely.
you're engaging with people. So thank you so much, Fran Ives, President-elect of the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and a podcaster yourself. So should we mention your podcast here?
So I do have a podcast. It's called All Systems Ergo, and it's a series of conversations about human factors in healthcare. And we have some really interesting people talking with great passion about the work they do.
Again, we'll put a link in the podcast notes so you can follow up and listen to Fran again there. So we have to leave it there, but as I say, there are links to the podcast notes to continue learning and listening. So thank you very much for tuning in, and thanks again, Fran Ives. Thank you.